You're watching NewsX. My name is Vineet Malhotra. Well, on the night of 2nd and 3rd December 1984, tragedy struck Bhopal. The world's first industrial disaster took place. More than 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas leaked from a pesticide plant in Bhopal. About 5,58,125 people were exposed to this highly toxic gas, and it ended up claiming the lives of almost 4,000 people, 3,787 to be exact. Well, yet the human cost of this tragedy exceeded the lives that were lost. The leak caused approximately 3,900 severely and permanently disabling injuries and also caused 38,478 people to suffer from temporary or partial injuries. Over the years, it has been established that sheer negligence caused this large-scale human suffering. The cost-cutting, poor safety standards, ignoring of prior leaks, as well as excess methyl isocyanate accumulation in the factory contributed to this horrible tragedy. Well, at the time of the disaster, the factory was majority owned by Union Carbide Corporation, which of course is a US-based company. This was later acquired by the Dow Chemicals company in 2001. Both these companies have ended up walking away scot-free after the disaster, which severely and adversely impacted lakhs of people who were innocent. This brings us to the big question today. Why did the previous governments let these two companies get away or go away scot-free? Is it high time to hold these American companies liable and bring justice to the victims of this horrible tragedy? We'll talk about this with our guest as well. Joining us on the show is Ambassador KP Fabian, former diplomat. Dr. PSV Rao, consultant surgeon, Manipal Hospital, also with us on the show. Mr. Alok Mehta, editorial director of India News, also joins us. Before that, I'm going to go to the big screen and give you some perspective as to what really happened, what was the cause, and what can we learn from this. The Bhopal gas tragedy, the negligence, that is the buzzword, the cost-cutting exercise because of which methyl isocyanate need not have been used as intermediate to produce a pesticide, meaning there were other options available. There were other types of chemicals which were less harmful, but because of cost cutting, it was cheap, it was used. The pesticide could be produced without this element, but at a higher cost. So, at the cost of having people around something which is dangerous, Union Carbide chose to have something which was cheaper. Due to decreased profits, local managers directed to close the plant for sale in July 1984. This was almost 40 years ago, and when no ready buyer was found, the UCIL made plans to dismantle key production units. And this, of course, led to some poor safety standards as well. The facility operated with safety equipment and procedures far below the standards that perhaps are exercised in the Western world today, especially in the United States. Well, the safety devices to neutralize toxic discharge turned off 3 weeks before the disaster because it had a cost attached to it. In January 1982, a phosgene leak exposed 24 workers, all of whom were admitted to a hospital with complications. So there were prior leaks which weren't learned from. A methyl isocyanate leak adversely affected about 18 workers in 1982 in February as well. No lessons learned. It continued to flaunt safety standards. In the same year, in October, methyl isocyanate leak left the supervisor with severe chemical burns, another safety hazard which was not learned from. In 1983 and 84, numerous leaks of MIC, chlorine, monomethylamine and phosgene also took place. This obviously went on about as business as usual, BAU, and the company kept making money and saving money at the cost of these poor workers. Demand for pesticides fell, but production continued, leading to accumulation of a number of harmful chemicals that eventually led to this tragedy. The facility housed 3 underground, 68,000 liters of methyl isocyanate, and it was stored in tanks. And these tanks, of course, were not properly insulated or kept away from the public at large. The regulations specified that the limit of the liquid MIC in tanks was about 30 tons, but that was also flouted. At the time of the disaster, the affected tank contained about 42 tons, which is 12 tons more than the capacity, which was in fact articulated in the rules for such chemicals to be stored. And of course, the Union Carbide management had other plans. Well, the jurisdiction of cases, civil and criminal case, was filed in the US against the UCC and the CEO, Warren Anderson, at that point in time. The cases in US were dismissed and redirected to India on multiple occasions between 1986 and 2012. And this is also a part of this tragedy. The US courts focused on the UCIL being a standalone entity of India and not something which worked in concomitance with the American company Union Carbide. In 1989, the UCC accepted moral responsibility to settle litigation stemming from this disaster. That was, of course, after a number of years. And in this settlement, which was mediated by the Supreme Court, the UCC agreed to pay $470 million to India. In June 2010, 7 Indian nationals who were UCIL employees in 1984 were convicted of negligence and being part of this entire mess up. They were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and a fine of about $2,000 each at that point in time. In 2013, a US Court of Appeals for Second Circuit in New York absolved UCC of any liability. They went scot-free, found not guilty. The US court concluded Union Carbide India Limited was responsible and not the parent company, that is the UCC. Of course, the buck was passed and the Indian part of the UCC was held accountable. The Dow Chemical Company purchased UCC in 2001, 17 years after the disaster took place. 3 years, CBI investigation took place and found that Union Carbide was responsible for inadequate safety measures, and that was the reason why this happened. Also found that the lack of emergency preparedness and cost cutting resulted in this tragedy. There were no apparatus to take care of any gas leaks. There were no personnel who were trained if something like this happened. The UCC had stated on record that it does not accept Indian jurisdiction and so it won't attend any of these proceedings as well. Since 2004, Dow has in turn been summoned to attend the ongoing criminal proceedings, even though they were not part of the original plan or the original disaster. The summons have been issued on 7 occasions, but Dow Chemicals is yet to comply with these summons. So obviously, there has been a shunning of responsibility. There has been no sense of absolution when it comes to Union Carbide. 3,787 people died in this tragedy. I'm going to take my first response from Dr. Rao on this. Dr. Rao, I'm sure you remember this day like yesterday. Perhaps some of us were very young to go back in time and actually articulate what exactly happened. But just for reference and perspective, around 3,000 people died when 9/11 took place, and the Americans spent about $3 trillion on war with Iraq and Afghanistan. That is the current, almost a little less than the current size of our economy as well. Almost 4,000 people died in this tragedy. And just like the Kanishka crash, there has been not a single person from the original company who has been brought to books. How do you see this episode in India's dark historic past?
Good evening, Vineet, the panelists and your viewers. There are some major underlying issues in these kind of cases. One, we should be very careful in allowing toxic or environmentally unfriendly things to be manufactured in this country. The Western world, especially US, is known to outsource all dangerous activity to third world countries, what they think is countries where they won't be liable to any kind of legal or other issues, which they will instead face in US. The pandemic that occurred is a classical example of a dangerous virus research which got banned in US and got outsourced to China. There are a lot of plastics and chemicals and various other things which have been outsourced to other countries. Not only that, a lot of dangerous waste is exported to countries like India to take care of them. Now, that is one issue, and we have to be very careful. I remember those days, our chief minister in Karnataka, I had by then shifted from Delhi to Bangalore, and I remember one of my close friends was in Bhopal on a short visit that time. And he safely came back, luckily, because he was far away from that gas leak. And Anderson, if I remember right, he was the chief who was there on the site, and he was quietly flown away. If I remember right, it was Arjun Singh who was the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh that time, and a special flight was arranged for him to escape from India. So the higher-ups in the political setup were hand in gloves in helping him escape any liability for this. And they ensured initially shoddy investigation because they were also trying to cover up their own lack of checks and balances. And the regulatory authorities are also responsible for this tragedy, not only the people who were actually running the plant. Third, any dangerous such thing, if you really want to do it, I would say go for natural herbicides and insecticides rather than these kind of dangerous chemicals. And as you mentioned, sometimes there are safer, costlier alternatives, but to save money and make greater profit, unsafe elements are used. Other than that, there is a huge problem of putting either any dangerous industry. It includes nuclear plants, it includes such chemical plants, etc., anywhere near the populated areas. The big mistake in Wuhan was that the research facility was in one of the most crowded and largest cities of China. It should be away from all habitation, in a place that even if there is a tragedy, it won't be a human tragedy. Of course, there will be an environmental tragedy. And these are things that we have to be very concerned about. Another thing I remember from those days was around that time, we had a chief minister by the name Ramakrishna Hegde. That time, Karnataka was surplus in electricity. He made a rule that any industry which consumes too much of electricity, any industry which does too much of pollution will not be allowed into the state. We will allow educational institutions to proliferate. We will allow research to proliferate. But if you are into any kind of polluting industry, he came down very heavily on some of the chemical industries and pharmaceutical industries and some of the mining industries and said, you are going to pollute this whole place. Please don't come to our state. You go anywhere you want. So these are all things that we have to look into and lessons we have to learn. Plants like this are best avoided.
Let me also get a word in from Mr. Alok Mehta on this. Mr. Mehta, are you there with us, sir?
Hello.
Sir, thank
Hello.
you. Sir, I can hear you well and loud, sir.
Yeah.
So this is a very dark episode in our history. A number of people died. This incident made international headlines. You know, the government of the day obviously was, for the lack of a better word, inept at getting these people who were responsible for this tragedy. But it's been 40 years. India does enjoy a certain level of, political strategic advantage. Do you think it is perhaps a moment for us to give closure to the people who were impacted by this tragedy?
Really, it was a shocking incident. Not an incident, it's a disaster in the whole century, what I will say. Because, you mentioned about the 3,500 people. But, officially or unofficially, because people, and I was also reporting at the time, I was with the Times Group. So I remember more than 15,000 people died. And thousands, more than half of the population. Mr. Rao was talking about that the real problem was because the person, Anderson, came here in the Bhopal, and then because of Narsura was the Home Minister, he called Arjun Singh and said, no, release him. Because when Anderson was arrested by the police. So since then, we are fighting. Anderson died after so many years in America. They never allowed him, the United States, they were allowed us, the India, to punish him because he was the real person. Who was the Union Carbide chief? He's a CEO. He developed this plant and everything. That's why even sometimes we feel, and still people are suffering. The 2 lakh rupees, can you imagine? You also mentioned the trillions of dollars they spent in the United States. Now they are talking to the Punnun, what we are planning or what we wanted. Some Indian was doing something. It is a very conspiracy type of thing. And for them, they are crying and they are going for the court and sending officials to India. But when our people die in thousands and people is still suffering, anybody can go from India or from United States and see how people are still suffering by cancer, by heart and kidney. Number of people is still suffering. And the compensation, can you imagine? Even Supreme Court or the court also, the Indian court, said even the other company, basically company, because they then say Union Carbide merged with someone. But the real culprit is still there and they are not paying the Indian people, the India. That's why, because when you mentioned about G20 and all, we have a very good relation since Rajiv Gandhi days. Because this incident took place when Rajiv Gandhi came in power, but he was very new. Then even we went, when I was also accompanying him, and in 85, we raised this issue. In June 85, Rajiv Gandhi also went there, when Ronald Reagan was there. Since then, India is fighting to the real culprit, and I feel the compensation. At least they should give more, $750 million. Can you imagine? Just for one. It was a major disaster than even Chernobyl. What I feel, in India, it was not a nuclear, but all the time they want to sell the aircraft. That's why Mr. Rao mentioned that when we have some agreement, we should not allow either this type of company, or that's why they are not ready to sign that they are responsible. They say, okay, if we have something in Indian company, they are responsible. No, I think if they have the policy, but we should also have a policy, and from Supreme Court also. I feel that there is scope, because number of people who was the chairman for the compensation, the Justice Qureshi was there in Bhopal. I remember he was the Justice also in those days. Later on, he was retired, and then he was the in charge. But even then, he was also writing. He was coming to Delhi, talking about it, the compensation. So you are very rightly mentioned that we should, India, and I am very thankful the NewsX that you are raising. I have also written a piece for Sunday Guardian. I think tomorrow, the people who are listening our program or watching this program, they should read how they behave, the Americans. We have very good relations. I still see everybody is not responsible. The companies and whatever they do, so many assassination in other countries, and they just blame India. You also mentioned Canada. Still the Air India plane. What happened in Canada? There is still people remember those days. So these kind of terrorists they allow in their country, United States and Canada, and for such incidents, because it's still at that time I was also feeling that there was a conspiracy to do experiment in India, how this gas will work, what the China did now in the COVID period. Nobody talked about it. But certainly, there was an experiment that how the chemical war can, because this was a chemical factory. So this was a very serious incident, disaster in the whole century. That's why I think still our people are fighting. The people who are suffering, they have the association, organization, but you can know poor people in Bhopal, old city people, they suffer. And still, I know the journalists also, they're suffering. Recently, Rajkumar Keswani was the journalist who also wrote at the time, and he died because he was also suffering. Even my family members were there, and I still feel that he was also there in the death night. So he got some problem, and then ultimately the whole life he is suffering. So I can imagine how people are still suffering, and United States ignoring all the time. They say, okay, because our law for American citizen, if American citizen as a terrorist living there, there is no problem. And if their company come in India and do such kind of mistake or the blunder or the conspiracy against the Indian people or do some experiment, when we say the China should be punished, I think still the company people, they are responsible and they should get punishment.
All right, Ambassador Fabian. So what are your memories of what transpired at that time? And, how is India supposed to demand any type of a redemption from the Americans who, of course, were, in charge of this entire operation?
Bhopal gets tragedy. Bhopal gets tragedy.
Ambassador Fabian.
Tomorrow is 3rd December.
Ambassador Fabian. So, Mr. Mehta, sir, can you please mute yourself, sir? We can still hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, NewsX, for taking up this topic because, the media often, not all, but at times the mainstream media tend to focus not on what is important. Now, this is very important, and I agree with the points made by the previous speakers. Dr. Rao was saying that a chemically hazardous plant should not be in an area where there is a concentration of population. Yes. Now, as a matter of fact, I was in Canada at that time, acting High Commissioner when it happened. But as a matter of fact, my friend Butch from the IAS, Madhya Pradesh cadre, he was the Deputy Commissioner when the proposal for having that factory there was moved, and he had on file written saying that we, meaning the Madhya Pradesh government, should not agree to have the factory established there where there is such concentration of population. But he was overruled, and as regards to the question, why was he overruled by let me put it this way, Chief Minister of the day? Well, I don't have the answer. All that I would say is that we in India should insist that the political leadership should give due deference to what bureaucracy tells them. After all, the civil service owes its allegiance to the Constitution of India, not to the particular political party. So my friend Butch did what he had to do, but he was overruled. That is point number one. Point number two is that my friend Professor Bianca Sulpasso in Italy has written many articles and also a book on this. And what she has said is that in the global south, often the governments lack the necessary expertise, because when you permit an MNC, multinational company, to establish such a factory, there should be a proper contract, and the contract should include very clearly that the company is responsible for any accidents or other damages. Now, that I'm afraid is not being done, and you might recall that after 123 agreement with the United States, many American companies were supposed to come and take part in the production of nuclear energy for civilian purposes. But they didn't come. Why? Because we had passed a legislation making it incumbent on the multinationals to be responsible for the consequences of accidents. In other words, the MNCs try to get away with blue murder. And my friend Bianca had even prepared a sort of a model contract for it. But I don't think our Ministry Department of Chemicals would have ever heard of it. So there is a certain apathy on the part of the bureaucracy also. Now, coming to justice, as already pointed out, the system has failed. That is, the executive, the government of India, the government of Madhya Pradesh, and the judiciary in India have failed to do justice. And coming to the United States, of course, the United States takes the view that American life is very, very valuable, while non-American lives doesn't matter much. So we have to learn our lessons, and I'm afraid we haven't learned it. And also, let me put it this way: it is because of poor people who were sort of the victims that we in India have taken less notice of it than we should have. So there is also a little bit of a class, what shall I say, discrimination.
All right, sir. Well, we've run out of time as well, but appreciate everyone joining us and sharing their thoughts and walking us back into history and telling us what really this entire saga entailed and why it continues to be unsolved even today.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.